Omega Directive, an Omega Taskforce novella. Written by G J Ogden, performed by Steve Barnes. Chapter 1. Commander Lucas Sterling groaned and pulled his pillow over his face, but the soft fabric barely managed to suppress the wail of the general alert. Prizing the pillow away from his eyes, he saw that the lights in his quarters were flashing red, each thumping pulse feeling like a punch to the nose. He turned his head and looked at the clock. It read 4:13 in the morning Zulu time. Sterling groaned again. He'd probably been asleep for all of 5 minutes. "At least I didn't bother to get undressed," he grumbled, sliding his legs off the bed and pulling on his boots. "Computer, cancel the damn alarm already!" he yelled to the AI assistant. "Acknowledged, Commander Sterling," the soft, unhurried voice of the computer said, dutifully obliging and returning the room lighting to a more subdued daylight white. "What the hell is it now? I've only just finished my shift on the bridge," Sterling added. He then dropped down onto the deck and began pushing out the first of 50 press-ups. "Apologies, Commander Sterling, but we are at general alert," the computer said in its usual unruffled tone. "We have been attacked by a Sonaran strike cruiser and boarded. Neural communications are down." Sterling paused on his 15th push-up, but remained in the plank position. "This had better not be a drill," he growled. It would be just like Captain Blake to start a battle drill 5 minutes after his head had hit the pillow, Lucas thought. Spiteful little bastard that he is. "This is not a drill, Commander," the computer replied. "The Omega Directive is in effect." "What the hell is the Omega Directive?" Sterling said, but the computer's response was interrupted by the door to his quarters swooshing open. Lieutenant Commander Ariel Gunn appeared in the threshold, wearing her standard-issue plasma pistol on her hip. "What the hell are you doing down there?" she asked, staring down at Sterling like he was performing some sort of tantric sex ritual. "I always do 50 push-ups when I get out of bed, you know that," said Sterling, resuming his mini-workout. "We're at general alert, Lucas! Get the hell out here!" Gunn hit back, anxiously peering along the corridor outside. "It's just a drill," Sterling answered, nonplussed by Gunn's obvious sense of urgency. "The captain is getting me back for calling out his shoddy tactics in the last strike ops planning meeting, that's all." The sound of plasma rifle fire then filtered in through the open doorway. Sterling stopped his count at 42 push-ups and jumped up. Normally he would never stop before 50 even if the ship was on fire, but plasma blasts were a different story. If the Sonara had actually boarded the ship, they were in serious danger. Sterling rushed to the door and peered outside, at the same time tapping the neural implant in his temple. "Sterling to bridge," he said, trying to reach one of the on-watch commanders through their neural link. However, there was no answer. "Commander Sterling to Captain Blake, come in." "They've blocked the neural link somehow," said Gunn, moving inside Sterling's quarters and opening his secured locker. She then removed his plasma pistol, loaded it with a fresh power cell, and handed it to him. Sterling scowled at her. "How do you know the code to my locker?" "You're a creature of habit," Gunn replied, shooting him a knowing smile. 50365, right? 50 push-ups a day, 365 days of the year, come rain, shine, or the breakout of interstellar war. Sterling grunted and took the weapon. "Remind me to be more unpredictable in the future," he said, still peering along the corridor. 3 Sonaran soldiers then ran past the intersection at the far end, and Sterling ducked back inside the door, cursing. "This is real," he said, more to himself than to Gunn. "How the hell did a Sonaran boarding party get onto a Hammer-class dreadnought?" Gunn shook her head. "The question I really want answered is what do they intend to do now they're here? They can't take over the ship because of our neural command interfaces, and even the Sonara wouldn't stoop to suicide missions." Sterling thought for a moment. He agreed with most of what Gunn had said, though the Sonara's tactics had changed over the last few months. The already fiercely aggressive warrior species was becoming even more belligerent. "Then it has to be sabotage," said Sterling, chancing another look along the corridor. The sound of plasma weapons was now more distant, suggesting the boarding party was heading away from their location. "They'll look to blow the reactors or maybe overload the engines somehow. And one less hammer on the front line is the last thing we need. The war is already going against us." Sterling's mind wandered back to their last operational briefing. The Sonara had taken 2 more deep space outposts and were advancing fast. There were also reports of warships going missing, the most significant of which was the Hammer's sister ship, the Vanguard. Something big had changed in the last few months to put the Sonara in the driving seat in the war. Prior to then, Fleet had repelled the initial invasion and were driving the aliens back toward their suspected homeworld, Kepler 452b. All attempts at communication and diplomacy had failed. This was largely on account of the fact that no scientist or linguist had a clue how the Sonaran language worked. The name of the species had been chosen based on the sound the alien beings made when breathing. It was a haunting, raspy sound, like a possessed medical ventilator. The only common language humans and Sonarans shared was the binary language of computers. Even then, the alien technologies were radically different, despite operating on the same fundamental scientific principles. The alien programming language, like their spoken one, was simply indecipherable. "With the Vanguard going MIA, we're the last Hammer-class dreadnought in this sector as it is," said Gunn, snapping Sterling back to the moment. "If they destroy this ship, they might be able to punch through to within striking range of the solar system again." Sterling cursed. He was angry that they'd allowed the Sonarans to slip through unseen. Some of this anger was directed at Captain Blake. It was his ship and so ultimately his responsibility. However, he was also aware that he'd only just come off shift, which meant the Sonaran cruiser had gotten into range on his watch, and that made it his responsibility too. "Do you know what the Omega Directive is?" asked Gunn, breaking Sterling's somber chain of thought. "The computer said the Omega Directive is in effect, but that's news to me." "It's news to me too, I'm afraid," replied Sterling, watching as another squad of 3 Sonaran warriors ran past the junction, firing their weapons. This time, in amongst the blasts, Sterling could hear the cries of pain, human cries. Sterling glanced back at Gunn, pistol raised and ready. "Whatever it is, it doesn't matter right now. We need to contact the bridge and find out what's going on. Since neural comms are down, our best bet on this deck is to get to the computer subcore and try to reach them through a hardline." "I'm with you, Lucas," said Gunn, thumping Sterling on the shoulder. "Let's move." Sterling headed out into the corridor first, moving swiftly to the junction where he'd seen the Sonara rushing past. Indicating for Gunn to move ahead, he covered their rear and backpedaled toward the computer subcore room, which managed all computer processing functions for Deck 4. 20 meters, then next left," said Sterling, remaining vigilant. "I know," replied Gunn, sounding slightly affronted. "I know this ship better than you, remember?" This had been a sore point between them. Despite going through officer training together and being friends for years, Sterling had made full commander before Gunn. That he'd also been reassigned to the Hammer, Gunn's current assignment, in a more senior position had hacked her off. She didn't resent Sterling's achievements. It was more that she was disappointed in herself. Sterling had chosen to join up, following in the footsteps of his parents. Both had been fleet captains. Both were killed in action. Gunn had been drafted from the civilian services. She was a gifted engineer, and just the sort of person Fleet needed to keep their aging battle fleet flying. However, there was still a part of Gunn that resented being forced to serve, and this resentment surfaced in her mannerisms and general attitude. She could be a pain in the ass, and this frequently rubbed the senior staff up the wrong way, including Sterling himself on numerous occasions. He knew that this was a major factor in what had held her back, even if she wouldn't admit it openly. Sterling and Gunn reached the computer subcore room, and Gunn entered her access code to unlock the door. Sterling moved alongside, weapon raised. "On 3, said Gunn, beginning a silent countdown, then hitting the button to open the door. The door swooshed back into its housing with a satisfying thud, and Sterling moved through first, swiftly followed by Gunn, both sweeping their weapons around the room. The lights were flickering, and Sterling could see weapons damage to the walls and some of the computer cores. Glancing over to Gunn, he indicated for them to move ahead. Then Sterling's heart leaped into his throat as he spotted a figure working in the shadows by the primary computer core. The figure was too tall to be a Sonaran warrior, and the unique, raspy sound of alien breathing was also absent. "Who's there?" Sterling called out to the figure, who turned from the computer core and stepped forward, catching the light. Sterling blew out an audible sigh of relief and lowered his weapon. "Reeves, what the hell are you doing skulking around in here?" he said. Lieutenant Reeves was a member of Sterling's beta shift. He was a young and slightly skittish damage control officer, but he was competent and tolerable to spend time with. "Lieutenant?" Sterling added when Reeves didn't answer his question. "Are you okay?" Lieutenant Reeves then darted towards Sterling, catching him completely by surprise. The officer's hands closed around his throat and pressed him against the wall. Sterling could hear Gunn barking orders at Reeves, but the man continued to add pressure, his eyes wild. Sterling broke the hold and thumped 2 hard shots into the lieutenant's gut, but the blows had little effect. Reeves struck back, the punch feeling like the kick of a mule, knocking the plasma pistol from Sterling's hand. The weapon skidded off toward the rear of the subcore, and the lieutenant raced after it with freakish speed. Sterling froze as Reeves collected the pistol and raised it. A plasma blast rippled across the room, racing past his head, and Sterling flinched, but he was not hit. Lieutenant Reeves, however, was thrown back against the wall, a deep plasma burn smoldering inside his left eye socket, where Gunn had shot him. Sterling rested on his knees and blew out another sigh. "Thanks," he said, glancing back at Gunn, who was approaching while still covering the body of Reeves with her weapon. Sterling collected his own plasma pistol from the floor, then inspected the dead officer's body, shaking his head. What the hell is going on here? He wondered, rolling the body onto its back. Then he noticed something around the neural implant on the lieutenant's temple and turned the officer's head to the side to get a better look. "What do you make of that?" asked Sterling, pointing to a dark, spidery pattern surrounding the implant. Gunn moved closer and inspected the implant with her keen engineer's eyes. "There's some tissue damage, though it's not from the plasma blast," she said, running her finger across the strange fractal pattern on the side of the dead officer's head. "But these markings are technological, not biological. It looks like the implant has malfunctioned and spawned some additional neural connections." Then she pointed to a raised section of the implant, which was surrounded by fresh blood clots. "But it's corrupted the implant in the process, and likely resulted in brain damage, too. I'd need to get the body into a lab to know more." Sterling nodded, then moved over to the control station for Deck 4's computer subcore. "We need to contact the bridge first," he said, entering a short sequence of commands to seal the room. He then initialized the main terminal interface and went to link his implant to the system, but Gunn jumped up to stop him. "Hey, wait," said Gunn, catching Sterling's wrist and pulling it away from the interface. "Until we know what happened to Reeves, I'd recommend we don't interface. You don't want to end up like him." Sterling glanced at the body of his former colleague. The stench of his burning flesh was still strong in the air. He felt no sense of remorse for Reeves' death. Sterling was known for his clinically cool demeanor, to the point where some, Ariel Gunn especially, considered him cold. "Good point," he said, rapping his knuckles against Gunn's shoulder. "But it's some time since I used one of these terminals the old-fashioned way." Gunn pressed her pistol into Sterling's other hand, then gestured for him to step away. "So guard the door, and let me do my thing," she said, cracking her knuckles and getting to work on the computer terminal. Chapter 2. Commander Sterling stood watch by the door to the computer subcore room, while Gunn tried to reach the bridge through a hardline connection. The volume and frequency of plasma weapons fire and screaming in the corridor outside was growing louder, and Sterling was becoming increasingly anxious. What he had initially hoped was perhaps a small, opportunistic raid now looked like a much bigger invasion of the ship. The Hammer was a potent force on the front line of the war, and with its sister ship, the Vanguard, still missing in action, Fleet couldn't afford to lose it. "Lucas, I think I've got something," said Gunn, waving him over. "It's a link to the planning room just off the main bridge." Sterling rushed to Gunn's side and peered at the console. Gunn had manually activated the wall screen in the mission planning room, essentially giving them a window onto part of Deck 1. However, from the plasma blast to the walls and the toppled chairs and furniture, it already looked like a battle had been fought inside the room. "Damn it! It looks like the Sonera have already reached the bridge," said Sterling, tightening his grip on the two plasma pistols. "We may have no choice but to storm in blind." Gunn appeared less than enamored by this suggestion. "The bridge could be crawling with Soneran warriors by now," she said, rubbing her temples. "The two of us wouldn't stand a chance." Sterling wasn't deterred. "Then we gather up whomever we can find along the way and form a fighting force." He then paused and glanced down to the corpse of Lieutenant Reeves. "Anyone that doesn't turn on us like he did anyway," he added, still troubled by the unexplained actions of his former shift member. "We raid a weapons locker and go in hard. We can't let the Sonera take the Hammer, Ariel. Without this capital ship on the front line to hold back these alien bastards, we're facing defeat in less than 6 months. Gunn appeared to reflect on what Sterling had said, her head bowed and expression brooding. Sterling knew that Gunn understood the tactical situation just as well as he did, and deep down she would know he was right. However, despite her engineering specialty and her reluctant fleet service, Ariel Gunn was as tough as they came and easily as tough as he was. Together, if they played it smart, Sterling was confident that they could take back the ship. Suddenly, the sound of plasma weapons fire erupted into the room, and Sterling spun around looking for the mystery attacker. However, besides himself and Gunn, the room was empty. Then he realized the sound was coming from the hardline feed to the mission planning room that Gunn had managed to establish from the computer subcore. Peering at the display, Sterling saw Captain Oscar Blake backing into the mission planning room, firing blindly back through the door, which then swished shut behind him. Switching his plasma pistol to a continual beam, Captain Blake then melted the seam of the door to physically seal it and hold off the Sonarans that had forced him to retreat. "Captain!" Gunn shouted, hoping that the audio link went both ways. "Captain, can you hear me?" Captain Blake spun around to face the screen, weapon raised. Recognizing the faces staring back at him, the captain ran closer, vaulting over turned chairs and broken furniture en route. When Blake's face appeared life-sized on the screen of the computer console, Sterling could see that blood matted his shimmering silver-gray hair, and that he had suffered numerous other cuts and minor injuries. "Commander Gunn, is that you?" said Captain Blake, keeping a keen eye on the door. Then he frowned. "Who's that with you?" "It's me, Captain," said Sterling, moving closer to Gunn so that Captain Blake could see them both clearly. "We've got hostiles on Deck 4, and by the looks of it, you have up there too. What's the situation?" Captain Blake met Sterling's eyes through the screen. The captain had always been a serious and humorless man, but he had never been anything other than supremely confident. This wasn't born out of arrogance, however. No one made captain on a capital ship like the Hammer if they didn't merit the rank and position. Yet for the first time since he'd known him, Captain Blake looked beaten, verging on desperate. "Commander, we don't have much time, so listen good," said Captain Blake, dabbing blood from his lip. "If I don't make it, you two will be the most senior command officers left on this ship." Sterling heard Gunn draw in a sharp intake of breath. "Do you mean that the rest of the main bridge crew is—" "Dead, Commander Gunn, or worse," Captain Blake cut in. "And don't interrupt. I have a lot to tell you in little time." Gunn nodded and swallowed hard, but remained silent, allowing the captain to continue. "What I'm about to tell you is captain's eyes are above. 6 months ago we lost contact with a recon ship scouting behind enemy lines. A month later that same ship reappeared, seemingly undamaged. However, the crew were acting strangely, almost as though they were drugged or hypnotized. Then, without warning, the ship rammed into Outpost 23. The explosive decompression killed everyone on board the outpost. We managed to recover what was left of the recon ship and its crew, and discovered something that has had profound implications for the success of this war. It's no exaggeration to say that this discovery is the reason why the Sonarans are now winning." There was a thudding noise from behind Captain Blake, and his head snapped back toward the door to the mission planning room. Uttering a blue curse into the air, the captain then continued. "I'm running out of time, Commander, so I'll make it brief," Captain Blake said while swapping the power cell in his plasma pistol and turning the power level to maximum. "The Sonara have developed a technology that can control our neural implants. Somehow using it, they can manipulate us like damned puppets. We lost control of 5 ships, including the Vanguard, before we pulled our forces back and out of danger. But now the bastards keep inching forward, using our own ships against us. Every ship we send at them, we now risk losing and having thrown back at us. It's a damned nightmare." "Captain, what is the Omega Protocol?" asked Sterling. He didn't want to interrupt, especially after Blake had chastised Gunn for doing so, but this question had preoccupied his mind ever since he was rudely awoken in his quarters. More than this, he had a feeling it was significant. "The computer said the Omega Protocol is in effect, but I've never heard of that protocol before." A cutting beam began slicing through the door to the mission planning room, and Captain Blake cursed again. "The Omega Protocol was designed to prevent the Sonara from capturing our ships and crew in the event we're boarded," the captain said, aiming his weapon toward the door. "Any officer or crew who is under Sonara neural control is to be considered an enemy combatant. You can recognize them by a unique pattern around their neural implant. That and the fact they act like they're damn zombies." The door behind Captain Blake was then blown inwards and 2 Sonaran warriors rushed in. Captain Blake shot them with 2 precisely aimed headshots, avoiding the protection offered by the warriors' durable alien armor. "You two have already been granted full command access to the Hammer, along with any other command-level officers that are still alive. The Omega Directive is simple. Retake the bridge and secure this ship at all costs." Captain Blake shot another Sonaran warrior that burst into the room, stumbling over the corpses of its fallen comrades. The captain then turned back to the screen and peered into Sterling's eyes with an intensity he'd never seen before. In that moment, he knew that Captain Blake didn't expect to make it out alive. "Kill anyone who is turned," the captain added with an unequivocal firmness. "I don't care who it is. It could be me, one of you two, or the goddamned admiral. If a command officer is turned, the Sonara get control of the hammer, and we can't afford to let the Sonarans have her. Do you understand me?" Sterling nodded. "I understand, Captain," he replied, giving his response with the authority and steadfastness expected of him. However, it wasn't just an act. Sterling did not need the stakes explained to him, and he didn't need convincing of the need to act decisively either. Gunn, however, was more hesitant in her reply. "Captain, wouldn't it be better to just evacuate the hammer and scuttle the ship?" she asked. Sterling could tell that Gunn had tried to offer the suggestion respectfully, but as was often the case, she merely came across as condescending. "Then there's no risk of the ship falling into enemy hands if we destroy it." "Damn it, Gunn, do you think Hammer-class dreadnoughts just appear out of stardust?" Captain Blake yelled, exploding at Gunn for her suggestion. "We can't afford to lose the hammer. We can't afford to lose any damned ship." Then the captain aimed his pistol at the screen like a wagging finger, his unsympathetic eyes practically drilling into Gunn's skull through the display. "So you fight tooth and nail to take back this ship. That is an order." Gunn straightened up, and this time she did not waver in her reply. "Understood, Captain." 3 more Sonaran warriors burst into the mission planning room, and this time Captain Blake's aim failed him. The captain managed to shoot one warrior cleanly in the head, but his next shot flew wide. Return fire zipped toward the screen, and Sterling ducked instinctively. Then he saw Captain Blake take a hit to the shoulder, and Sterling's hands bolt into fists. However, from the sound and shape of the bolt, Sterling could tell it was a low-intensity blast designed to hurt rather than to kill. The Sonara were trying to capture the captain, Sterling realized, clenching his fists even more tightly. The 2 remaining Sonaran warriors then advanced, one of them drawing a device from an attachment on its armor. To Sterling, it looked like a large pair of industrial pliers, and more like a medieval torture device than an advanced piece of technology. The alien warrior activated the device, which expanded to the width of a human head, and Sterling suddenly realized what the alien intended to do with it. The Sonaran thrust the device towards the captain's brow, but Captain Blake just managed to throw up his arm in time to block it. "Retake the bridge!" Captain Blake yelled as the second Sonaran warrior then attempted to wrestle the captain's hand down so that the device could be attached around his head. "Don't use neural comms, they can track you," he added, still struggling against the 2 powerful alien warriors. Then with every last ounce of strength in his body, Captain Blake shoved the Sonarans away. He turned to the screen and pressed his plasma pistol underneath his chin. "And whatever you do, Commanders, do not let them turn you!" Then Captain Blake pulled the trigger, and his head exploded, covering the screen with blood and fragments of brain and bone. "Captain!" Sterling yelled, hammering his fist down on the console. But it was a knee-jerk response born from pure shock. It was obvious that their captain was dead. Crying out his name just made him feel foolish and even more furious. The 2 Sonaran warriors looked into the screen, peering at Sterling and Gunn, with round yellow eyes the size of drinks coasters. The alien's raspy breathing came through the speakers, along with other utterances that sounded similarly haunting and ethereal. "You'll pay for that, you alien bastards!" Sterling growled, thumping his fist into the screen. He had never cared for Captain Blake, but he had respected him. He was their captain, after all, and because of the Sonaran invaders, he was gone. "I'll be seeing you soon," Sterling added, jabbing his finger into the eye of one of the aliens. However, the 2 Sonaran warriors merely continued to glare back at him through the screen, before one of them raised its weapon and fired. The screen went blank, leaving Sterling with the afterimage of 2 alien warriors imprinted on his eyes. The darkness and silence that followed felt funereal, like a 2-minute silence for the dead. Suddenly the screen flicked back on, but instead of showing the mission planning room, it was displaying new orders, specifically addressed to Commander Lucas Sterling and Lieutenant Commander Ariel Gunn. Sterling read the orders out loud, if only to break the deafening silence that had followed Captain Blake's suicide. "Sterling Lucas, rank Commander, is hereby granted full command and control of Fleet Dreadnought Hammer. Gunn Ariel, rank Lieutenant Commander, is hereby granted full command and control of Fleet Dreadnought Hammer." Sterling glanced at Gunn, and was heartened to see that there was no fear behind her eyes. There was shock, uncertainty perhaps, but not fear. He hoped that his own eyes conveyed the same fortitude. "Omega Directive is in effect," Sterling continued, reading from the screen. "Terminate all enemy threats and secure command of Fleet Dreadnought Hammer. Any fleet officer or crew member that has been exposed to the Sonaran neural weapon is to be considered an enemy combatant and terminated with extreme prejudice. There are no exceptions. In the event of capture, self-terminate. Omega Directive ends. A chill ran down Sterling's spine. He had been fine with the order until the very last few words. In the event of capture, self-terminate, he repeated in his mind. He'd literally just witnessed the worst-case scenario of the Omega Directive played out before his own eyes. He had no desire to end up like Captain Blake, but he also had no intention of letting the Sonaran take the hammer, or force him or any other member of the crew to become their puppets. If that meant killing his shipmates, or even himself, he'd do it. "What do we do now?" said Gunn, breaking the sudden and painful silence that had followed Sterling's reading of the order. Sterling handed Gunn's plasma pistol back to her and stood tall. "We do what our captain ordered," he said, his tone firm and resolute. "We get to the bridge and kill these alien bastards. Then we take command of the hammer and get her back into the fight." Chapter 3. Commander Sterling pushed open the crawlspace hatch to Deck 3 and climbed through, weapon raised. The general alert lights were still flashing in the corridors, though the klaxon had mercifully fallen silent. Once Sterling was clear of the hatch, Lieutenant Commander Gunn climbed out and dusted down her uniform. "The closest weapons locker is in Quadrant 4, Section 10, said Sterling, sweeping his rifle up and down the corridor. The sound of plasma blast filtered along the passageways, and to Sterling's ears it was growing louder. Whoever was firing the weapons was coming in their direction. "This would be a lot easier if we could use neural comms to find out who else is on this deck," he complained, stalking along the corridor towards Section 10. "It would be easier if we just evacuated all the command-level officers," Gunn replied, not even bothering to disguise her irritation. Gunn was still smarting from Captain Blake's hard shutdown of her idea to scuttle the hammer, Sterling realized. In many ways, he agreed with her. Command and control functions were intrinsically linked to their neural implants, precisely in order to prevent a fleet warship from being captured. Removing anyone with command rank from the ship nullified the Sonaran threat. Yet abandoning ship would still mean losing it, and as Captain Blake had explained, they needed every ship they had if they were going to win the war. "You heard what the captain said," replied Sterling, checking around the corner at the next junction. "We can't afford to lose the hammer, especially if the Sonarans already have control of the Vanguard." Sterling waved Gunn on, and she darted across the junction before turning back to cover him. "Something about this just doesn't add up, that's all," Gunn replied, refusing to let it go. "I spent several years at the fleet orbital shipyards, and we were building hulls like there was no tomorrow. New designs, smaller and more efficient, but still powerful. It just doesn't make sense to risk so much on this old crate. The hammer is 20 years old now, it's hardly state-of-the-art." Sterling stopped and met Gunn's eyes. "Why don't you ask the captain when we get to the bridge?" he said, growing agitated with Gunn's cynical ramblings. Then he snapped his fingers. "Oh, that's right, we just saw him blow his own damned head off after giving us a direct order to retake the ship." Gunn scowled. "Sarcasm is the lowest form of wit, you know." Sterling shook his head at Gunn and continued on to the next intersection. "Look, let's just carry out our orders and save the questions till after the Sonarans are in body bags." "Yes, sir, Commander," Gunn replied crabbily. Sterling took a deep breath, trying not to let Gunn push his buttons. Then, as he peeked around the corner toward the weapons locker, his frustration with Gunn's exasperating behavior vanished. "Crap, there are 6 Sonaran warriors heading this way," he said, darting back into cover. Gunn raised her weapon and became laser-focused. "Can we go around them?" Sterling shook his head. "It would take too long, and there's no guarantee we won't just run into another squad elsewhere on the ship. I say we take these assholes down." Gunn nodded. "I'll switch across and go low on your order." Sterling gave the command, then leaned out and fired at the advancing Sonaran squad. At the same time, Gunn rolled across to the opposite side of the junction and stayed low, opening fire moments later. 3 of the warriors fell before plasma fire was returned in their direction. One of the plasma bolts thudded into the wall, inches from Sterling's head, and he ducked out of sight, cursing and rubbing hot splinters of metal from his face. Gunn continued to fire, taking another warrior down, but the Sonarans were already charging at them. Sterling turned back just in time to see the butt of a plasma rifle being thrust at his head. He narrowly avoided the blow and hooked a left jab into the Sonaran's body. On a human, it would have been a kidney shot, but the Sonaran anatomy was different, and the punch winded the alien instead. Seizing his opportunity, Sterling grabbed the warrior's head and smashed its face into his knee. Even that wasn't enough to put the alien down, but 2 shots from his plasma pistol at point-blank range did the trick. Heart-pounding and breathless, Sterling turned to see the other Sonaran warrior strangling Gunn with one hand while trying to press a neural device onto her head with the other. He fired, blasting the alien in the back, hitting one of its vital organs and killing it instantly. Sterling rushed over to her as she pushed the dead alien away and scrambled back against the wall, which was still smoldering from her earlier plasma blasts. "Hey, are you okay?" Sterling asked earnestly, grabbing Gunn by the shoulders and peering into her eyes. She was shaken, but not in shock, and she nodded her head. "Next time I say you go low," Gunn said, rapping her knuckles on Sterling's chest to signify she was okay. Sterling released Gunn's shoulders, then picked up the device that the alien had tried to attach to her head. "Did it manage to get this thing on you?" he asked, inspecting the device, then focusing his gaze onto Gunn's neural implant. There were shallow cuts where the device had scraped across her skin, but the implant looked normal. "I don't think so," Gunn replied, holstering her pistol and picking up one of the Sonaran plasma rifles instead. "I'm okay, let's get moving." Sterling did the same, though the feel of the alien weapon in his hands was unnatural. "These Sonaran rifles pack a punch, but I'd still rather get to the weapons locker and grab something more familiar." "Fine, but let's do it quickly and move up to deck 2, Gunn replied, looking far more at home with the alien weapon than he was. As a southpaw, the Sonaran technology was more manageable for her than it was for Sterling. Commander Sterling took the lead again, and they both moved swiftly into Section 10. The corridor started to widen out to accommodate rows of storage lockers, but as they got closer it became clear they were not the only ones in the area. "Hold up, I see 3 fleet uniforms already at the locker," said Sterling, thrusting out an arm to make sure Gunn didn't move past him and alert the other fleet crew. At his current distance from them, Sterling couldn't tell for sure if they were normal, or crew members that the Sonara had already turned. "Can you see if they're changed, or whatever the captain said that alien gizmo does?" said Gunn, slotting in behind Sterling and whispering to him. "Turned," Sterling corrected her. Inching closer, he managed to get a better look at one of the men by the weapons locker. Sterling's fleet-enhanced 2010 vision was able to discern the man as Lieutenant Commander Stevenson, an engineering officer. However, Stevenson's wavy mop of hair was covering his implant, and Sterling couldn't see whether it looked normal or corrupted by the Sonaran device. The 2 others with Commander Stevenson, a man and a woman, were enlisted crew members that Sterling didn't recognize. "Hey, that's Kyle," said Gunn, who had sneaked a look over Sterling's shoulder while he'd been watching the group by the locker door. "You're on first-name terms, huh?" replied Sterling with more snark than he'd intended. "I do know other people besides you, you know," Gunn hit back with matching bite. Then she focused her similarly precise eyes on the trio of fleet personnel. "I don't know what the hell he's trying to do, though," she added. Sterling could see that Stevenson was attempting to open the weapons locker, but it looked like the commander was just punching random sequences into the keypad with all the finesse of a Neanderthal. All high-security sections of the ship had both neural and physical security measures in place, though the fact Stevenson was struggling to even remember a pin made Sterling immediately suspicious. However, before he could come up with a plan, Gunn had moved out from behind him and started to approach the group. "Ariel, get back here!" Sterling called out in hushed tones, but Gunn raised a hand and waved him off. "If they turn on me, I'm relying on you to save my ass," she said, still pacing cautiously towards the 3 fleet crew members. "Hey, Kyle, what's up?" said Gunn as she drew closer to the group, alien rifle aimed low, though Sterling could see that her finger was on the trigger. "You seem to be having a little trouble?" Commander Stevenson turned to Gunn, and though he was standing bolt upright, he looked like he was half asleep. Gunn froze, then tapped her temple, and began to slowly back away. Sterling cursed, guessing that Gunn's signal meant that Commander Stevenson was no longer with them. Suddenly, the engineering officer lunged at Gunn, but she had anticipated the attack. Raising the alien weapon, she fired a plasma bolt directly into the officer's gut. Sterling moved out from cover moments later, rifle raised, and aimed at the other 2 crew members. Both turned to face him, expressions blank and bodies taut, like they were being subjected to a low-voltage electric shock. Then, without warning, the 2 turned fleet crew members charged. Sterling fired twice, hitting both in the chest, but remarkably they continued coming, despite the shots burning holes through their flesh down to the bone. He fired again, hitting the same locations with bolts that burned through bone and vital organs. This time the 2 crew members toppled like felled trees, and once again Sterling's nose was filled with the repugnant stench of burning flesh. "Lucas, get over here!" Gunn called out. Sterling saw that Gunn was kneeling down beside Commander Stevenson, who appeared to still be alive. He quickly checked the adjoining corridors, but there was no sign of other Sonarans, or any more of the Hammer's crew, turned or otherwise, so he ran to Gunn's side. "He's still alive," said Gunn, looking at Sterling with wide, frantic eyes. Sterling knew what she was about to ask, and already knew what his answer would be. "We need to treat his wounds and stabilize him," Gunn went on. "Maybe we can then snap him out of this and bring him back." Sterling peered down at the wounded officer, but the man's eyes were still glassy and vacant. Considering that his intestines had just been cooked, Stevenson should have been dead already, or at least in immense pain, but there was no reaction at all. Sterling knew that trying to treat the injured commander was pointless, and he had no intention of wasting his time trying. However, he knew that Gunn would not accept his decision without a fight. "I hate to sound cold, but he's already gone, Ariel," said Sterling, conscious of more plasma weapon fire in the distance. "We have to move on." Gunn shot Sterling a look that could have cracked glass. "If you hate to sound cold, then don't be so damned cold," she snapped. Gunn then held Stevenson's chin and forced the officer to look at her. "Kyle, it's me, Ariel," she said, talking to the man like a nurse talking to a patient who was in shock. "Can you hear me, Kyle?" "Ariel, we don't have time for this. We have to go," Sterling said, trying to pull Gunn away from the injured man, but she merely shook him off roughly. Sterling's patience was already threadbare, and this tipped him over the edge. "Lieutenant Commander Gunn, leave this man. That is an order," he snapped. Gunn spun around to face him, and for a moment Sterling thought she was going to hit him. Then Stevenson's glossy eyes grew wide, and the officer clasped his hands around Gunn's throat, squeezing her neck with inhuman strength. Sterling punched the officer in the face with all his might, but still Stevenson's grip remained strong. Cursing, he then stepped back, aimed the alien plasma rifle, and shot Stevenson in the head. The blast at such close range not only melted the officer's skull, but the deck behind it too. The stench made Sterling gag, but he fought back the sensation and dropped to Gunn's side. She was wheezing and coughing bitterly, but not seriously hurt. "Damn it, Ariel, stop being a pain in the ass and stick to the damn mission!" Sterling yelled, checking out her injuries. A few seconds longer and the turned officer would have crushed her windpipe. Gunn nodded and tried to speak, but no words came out. "Just stay quiet for a change," said Sterling, hauling her back onto her feet. He then moved over to the door to the weapons locker and entered the correct code. The locking device scanned his neural implant, and the door opened. He helped Gunn inside and sat her down on a bench beside the door. "Hang tight, there's a med kit in here somewhere," he said, locking the door behind him. Sterling then rifled through the contents of the weapons store and pulled out a combat med kit. Dropping down to Gunn's side again, he tore open the pack and set to work. "These will take care of the swelling and the pain and accelerate healing," he said, hitting Gunn with a trio of capsules from a jet injector he'd taken from the med kit. "But you'll need to get yourself checked out by the doc once this is over." Gunn rubbed her throat, though Sterling could already hear that her breathing sounded more natural. The agonized look of pain on her face had relaxed, too. "Remind me not to try saving any more turned crew members," she said, grabbing hold of the weapons rack and pulling herself up. Her voice was still a little hoarse, like she had laryngitis or a bad cold. "I already tried telling you that," said Sterling, pulling on a combat vest from the locker and replacing his alien rifle with a fleet weapon. "In fact, if I recall correctly, I ordered you to leave the damn man on the deck." Gunn didn't answer, but a quick glance in her direction suggested that his unsympathetic tone hadn't gone unnoticed. "I'm glad you're not a medical officer with a bedside manner like that," Gunn hit back, grabbing her combat vest. She then loaded a standard-issue fleet plasma rifle and nodded to Sterling. "But don't worry. The next zoned-out fleet officer I see is getting a plasma bolt right between the eyes." Gunn then raised her hand to the door panel to unlock it, but Sterling caught her wrist. "Hey, remember what the captain told us," Sterling said, releasing his grip now that he had Gunn's attention. "It doesn't matter who it is. If they're turned like Stevenson was, we put them down. No questions, no exceptions, got it?" Gunn's eyes narrowed and she looked angry. "I got it, Lucas. No need to drill it home like I'm a damn rookie." "That goes for me too," Sterling said, cutting across Gunn. "If they get one of those neural devices on me, you take me down straight away. No holding on just in case. No trying to snap me out of it. You just aim and shoot, agreed?" Gunn was still angry, though it was now for a different reason. "I'm not a robot like you, Lucas. I can't just pull the trigger on people I care about." "You're going to have to, Ariel," replied Sterling frostily. He then unlocked the door and peered outside. The coast was clear, and he turned back to Gunn, locking his eyes onto hers. "Because, believe me, if you get turned, I won't hesitate to shoot. And neither should you." Gunn snorted and shook her head. "It's no wonder you got promoted ahead of me," she snapped, pushing past Sterling. "Fleet loves cold-hearted bastards like you." Chapter 4. Commander Sterling hurried after Gunn, but was then thrown against the wall by a hard thump that resonated through the corridor and shook the deck plates. Sterling steadied himself as another thud rattled the metal floor beneath his feet, like the vibration of a nightclub subwoofer. Just ahead of him, Gunn was caught in the middle of the corridor and forced to drop to a crouch, pressing a hand to the deck to stay balanced. "Those sounded and felt like plasma cannon impacts," said Sterling, staying close to the wall as another tremor shuddered through the ship. "Then why the hell aren't we firing back at whatever's firing at us?" said Gunn, staggering over to the wall and pressing her back to it next to Sterling. "Maybe the gun crews have already been turned or killed," offered Sterling, steeling himself against another hard shimmy that pounded the structure of the aging battleship. "If that's the case, then the invasion force is a lot bigger than we thought." Sterling then had a more worrying thought. The guns on the Hammer were deadly, but they weren't the ship's only form of defense. "I would have expected our alert fighters to have engaged by now," he added, thinking out loud. "If the Sonera have taken the hangars too, we really are screwed." Gunn cursed and pounded her fist into the wall. "Damn it! If we could just use neural comms, then we could contact the people on this deck and get an update," snapped Gunn. "How have the Sonera managed to do all this without Fleet noticing or even warning us? Stealth isn't exactly the go-to tactic for these alien bastards." Sterling pushed away from the wall and activated a service console. He was about to interface with it before remembering Gunn's warning to avoid neural connections until they understood the nature of the new Sonaran weapon. Instead, he flexed his fingers and operated the console manually, bringing up a selection of external observation feeds from cameras on the outer hull. Quickly spotting the cause of the quakes, he tapped the appropriate feed and enlarged the image. 2 Sonaran destroyers were lurking off their port side, hammering the ship with focused plasma blasts. "There's our problem," said Sterling, jabbing his finger at the ships on the display. Gunn studied the screen, then frowned. 2 destroyers, that's it?" she said, sounding almost insulted. "They're not even the current Mark IV models. They look like Mark II designs, which makes them even older than this hunk of junk." Sterling also frowned and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Gunn was right about the veteran status of the attacking vessels. Under normal circumstances, a couple of Phase II Sonaran destroyers posed no real threat to a Hammer-class dreadnought. However, left unchallenged, even these smaller and weaker Sonaran ships would eventually cause critical damage to the ship. It was like constantly chipping away at a concrete block with a rock hammer. If you hit the block enough times in the same place, eventually it will break. "Well, unless we stop them, those 2 little gnats out there are still going to be a problem," said Sterling, bringing up a schematic of the ship and pinpointing their location. "Unless we stop them?" repeated Gunn, now frowning at Sterling instead of the Sonaran destroyers. "We're supposed to be retaking the bridge, remember? What the hell do you propose we do to stop those destroyers?" Sterling jabbed his finger onto the map. "We're here on Deck 2, Quadrant 1, Section 5. That puts us close to the port side ventral rail guns in the forequarter." Gunn pressed her hands to her hips and shook her head. "Come on, Lucas, don't we have enough to do already?" Sterling plotted the quickest route to the gun battery, then added in a route from the battery to the bridge. "We detour through the battery, take out those annoying gnats, then move up to the bridge through these service crawl spaces," Sterling went on, ignoring Gunn's protests. "There are other crew on the ship, Lucas. We can't do everything," said Gunn, still pressing her point. "We don't know who's left," Sterling hit back, taking a harder edge with his friend and colleague. "We should assume it's just us, until proven otherwise." Gunn sighed and raised her plasma rifle. "When you inevitably get promoted to captain once this is all over, make sure not to draft me into the crew of the Fleet Super Dreadnought slave driver, okay?" "Request denied," said Sterling with a hint of a smirk. "Now come on, Commander, we have aliens to kill." Sterling led the way, moving past the bodies of dead Sonaran warriors and other Fleet crew, some of whom he could see had been turned. The frequency of corpses increased the closer they got to the gun battery. "It looks like we missed the party," said Gunn, stepping over a dead engineering crew member. Then she stopped and did a double take before turning back and kneeling by the woman's side. Gunn carefully turned the dead crew member's head to reveal the spider-like pattern around her neural implant. "I knew her," Gunn added, a hint of melancholy in her voice. "This was Specialist Laska. She was a good worker, bright, supervisor material." "More on the dead later," said Sterling in a flat and unemotional tone. He then stepped over the corpse and moved toward the door leading into the gun battery. It had already been melted open. "Yes, sir, Commander Heartless, sir," quipped Gunn in a mocking tone. Sterling knew that the remark wasn't meant in a mean-spirited way, but it got his goat nonetheless. Gunn then left the dead crew member's side and moved up to the melted opening into the gun battery. Sterling stopped her before she could step through. "Ariel, don't take this the wrong way, but I need you to cut the crap and get your mind on the mission," said Sterling. His frustration with Gunn had been building up steadily over the last hour, and it showed in the tone of his voice, which was sterner than he had intended. Gunn recoiled and looked wounded, but she didn't come back with an expected quick retort. Sterling considered backing off, but he had to get his concerns off his chest so that he could keep his head clear and focused on the task at hand. He was used to Gunn's little quips, and normally they didn't bother him. Like others who had been drafted, it was normal for there to be some lingering resentment towards their employer, and to her credit, Gunn never displayed her brazen disregard for Fleet in public, nor did she let her team see that side of her either. Sterling had always taken it as a compliment that Gunn felt comfortable enough with him to let her guard down, and he didn't begrudge her doing so in the slightest. However, now was not the time. Their captain was dead, the ship was under siege, and they may well have been the only two people on board who could do anything about it. "There are 2,000 people on this ship, Ariel, and it's on us to make sure they survive," Sterling went on, committing himself to the act of rebuking Gunn. "So stop being a wise-ass and keep your emotions under lock and key, at least until this is over." Sterling's heart was thumping in his chest even harder than when he'd witnessed the captain blow his own head off, or when they'd fought the Sonarans. He didn't want to damage their friendship, but if it came down to ending their relationship or losing the ship, there really was no choice. Gunn chewed the inside of her mouth for a couple of seconds, staring back into Sterling's eyes. She didn't look embarrassed to have received a dressing down from her friend. She looked furious. "Yes, sir," she eventually replied, but to Sterling's ears it sounded very much like an F.U. Sterling considered adding more, but figured that he'd said enough already. If their friendship was strong enough, it would survive this moment, he told himself. And if not, they were probably both going to die anyway, so it didn't make a damned bit of difference. Sterling moved through into the gun battery with Gunn close behind, her face like thunder. The lights inside the cavernous gun battery room flickered and buzzed, and conduits sparked and crackled with energy where plasma blasts had burned holes into the deck and walls. More bodies littered the floor, both Sonaran and human. Sterling moved on, and his advance went unchallenged, until he reached the first in a row of 10 railguns that dominated the outer wall. Each of the turrets sat inactive and useless, the bodies of their crews lying dead around them. He was about to call over to Gunn to see if she could use her engineering news to reactivate the weapons when a plasma bolt seared past his head, missing by what seemed like inches. "Gunn, get down!" Sterling called while himself diving for cover. Another 3 blasts split the air, slamming into the walls and deck, but by sheer luck Sterling escaped unharmed. He glanced across the room looking for Gunn and saw her crouched behind the battery captain's station. Using hand signals, she indicated 2 enemy contacts ahead, but was then pressed further back into cover as a volley of plasma bolts thudded into the station. Sterling leaned out and opened fire on the 2 Sonaran warriors who were running toward Gunn's position. Plasma bolts flashed through the air and both of the alien warriors fell hard to the deck. A third Sonaran ran out from behind one of the other rail guns and fired at Sterling, again missing him by the narrowest of margins. Keeping his cool, he returned fire, hitting the alien in the head and killing it instantly. "Ariel, move up!" Sterling called over to Gunn. He then advanced to the railgun turret where the alien he'd just shot had sprung out from. Gunn moved up across the opposite side of the gun battery room, picking off another Sonaran warrior as she did so. Sterling waited to see if any more of the alien invaders would show themselves, then took the chance to move ahead. However, he'd only made it a few meters before a Sonaran warrior leaped out of the shadows and tackled him to the deck. Sterling lost control of his plasma rifle as he fell, and the weapon skidded out of his reach. The next thing he knew, the alien had pounced on top of him, a curved, serrated blade in his hand. The warrior thrust the blade at Sterling's throat, but he blocked the attack, then caught the alien's wrist. Sonaran warriors were physically stronger than humans, but Sterling had conditioned his body over the course of the last 10 years to match or exceed the physical abilities of the belligerent aliens. And in this test of might, Sterling was winning. Suddenly, the alien seemed to notice the rank insignia on Sterling's collar and let out a waspish, hissing cry. 4 more Sonarans appeared from out of the shadows. One was shot instantly by Gunn, but then she too was tackled to the deck. "Ariel!" Sterling shouted, trying to spot her, but the alien attacker had bundled her into the alcove next to one of the rail guns. Then he heard her scream, the cry sending a chill down his spine. His heart raced and a rush of adrenaline surged through his veins. For Commander Lucas Sterling, there was no fight or flight response to contend with. There was only fight. Throwing the Sonaran off his body, Sterling jumped up and hammered a kick to the alien's knee, snapping it like a twig. The warrior let out a hissing cry and thudded onto the deck like a butchered carcass. The Sonarans may have been strong and their thick skins hard to penetrate, but Sterling knew their weaknesses. He knew how to kill them. Sterling barely had chance to suck in another lungful of air before the remaining 2 Sonaran warriors were on him. Then he saw that one of the aliens was holding a neural control device in its leathery hand. The implement was primed and ready to attach to Sterling's implant, making it more dangerous than any plasma rifle or knife. Dodging out of the path of the aliens, Sterling collected the curved, serrated blade from where the maimed warrior had dropped it and squared off against the two Sonarans. The first lunged at him and Sterling swung the blade, managing to slice through the alien's thick Sonaran skin, but it didn't stop its advance. Sterling tried to evade the warrior, but it grabbed him and pulled him into a bear hug, clamping his arms by his sides. The second Sonaran then came forward, neural control device outstretched in front of him, but Sterling was powerless to resist. Suddenly a bolt of plasma struck the Sonaran in the side of the head, melting half of its cranium in the process. The stench of burning alien flesh was even worse than that of human bodies, like rotten animal carcasses on a pyre. Sterling saw Gunn stagger out from the shadows, bleeding from a cut to her head. The alien that was holding Sterling then released its grip and backed away. Its large yellow eyes saw a plasma rifle on the deck and it went for it, but Sterling was quicker. He hammered a knife-hand strike to the back of the warrior's neck, hitting another weak point in the alien's otherwise durable frame. The Sonaran fell flat on its face, momentarily paralyzed from the blow. Sterling dragged the Sonaran plasma rifle out from underneath it, aimed the barrel at the warrior's head, and fired. The repugnant smell of melting skin and bone again saturated his senses. "Damn it, these things smell worse than a block latrine," said Gunn, hobbling over to Sterling with the sleeve of her uniform pressed over her mouth and nose. Sterling, however, had not covered his nose or moved away from the smoldering alien. Gunn looked at him as if he were on fire. "How can you stand it?" Sterling sighed, then tossed the alien weapon to the deck. "This won't be the last time we're subjected to the stench of burning alien flesh," he said, meeting Gunn's eyes with cruel determination. "So we may as well get used to it." Sterling's eyes were then drawn to the Sonaran warrior that he had struck to the knee earlier. It was crawling across the deck, trying to reach a discarded weapon. "What do we do about that one?" said Gunn. But Sterling was already advancing toward it. Kicking the alien in the gut, Sterling then rolled the warrior onto its back. Its yellow eyes peered up at him, hands outstretched, though there was nothing he could discern from the alien's expression. If it was afraid or angry or repentant, he couldn't tell. Raising the rifle, Sterling shot the warrior in the face, then tossed the alien weapon to the deck. Gunn's expression scrunched into a frown, but this time it wasn't from the smell of the dead bodies at her feet. Sterling recognized the look. It was the one she always gave him when he said something or did something that sent a chill down her spine. "Sometimes, Lucas, you scare the crap out of me," she said, though for once she wasn't joking. The deck then shuddered, and Sterling and Gunn grabbed hold of each other for support. "I've had it with these damn Sonaran destroyers," snarled Gunn, moving over to the nearest railgun emplacement. She checked it over, then activated the control station for the weapon. "Luckily, there's nothing wrong with these guns, apart from there being no crew to fire them." Sterling ran back to the battery captain's station and activated it. The computer responded without delay, but the system was locked down. "Command override Sterling Lucas, rank commander," he said, hoping that the captain was correct about the Omega protocol giving him the keys to the whole ship. "Command override recognized," the computer replied, in its usual unflustered tone. Sterling glanced up and saw that Gunn was waiting at railgun emplacement 4, looking at him expectantly. "Activate gun 4 and enable window," he said. Railgun 4 immediately powered up, and a few moments later the end wall of the room turned opaque, showing a clear view out into space. In reality, it was just an illusion, a holographic trick to make it look like the bulkhead had vanished. However, while the technology didn't expose them to the vacuum of space, it did expose the two Sonaran destroyers. 4 more blasts erupted from the small warships, and the hammer was rocked again. "To hell with these bastards," Sterling muttered out loud. He then targeted the 2 ships and unlocked the safeties on gun emplacement 4. "They're all yours," Sterling said, strolling over to Gunn's side, so that he could get a ringside seat. "Let's see if you live up to your name." Gunn smiled, then operated the railgun controls. The massive turret swung out toward the 2 alien ships, and the thrum of its energy core began to vibrate the deck. "Engineers don't normally get to fire the heifers," she said, working the controls as if she'd been doing it all her life. "So I'm going to enjoy it." Sterling smiled. He too had rarely operated a heifer, the informal term for the hyper-focused energy and radiation plasma railgun weapon that Gunn now had locked on the Sonaran destroyers. However, he was content to observe in this instance, knowing there would be plenty more destruction to come. Gunn grabbed the firing control and pulled the trigger. The weapon fired, sending a focused ball of energetic plasma racing toward the closest of the two destroyers. It struck the vessel on the aft section, obliterating it like a flaming hammer smashing an egg. The second ship immediately turned and its engines lit up, attempting to escape, but Gunn had already adjusted her aim. The massive turret tracked the target and Gunn squeezed the trigger again, sending a second bolt of plasma soaring out into space. This time, the destroyer was split in half from stern to bow, the two pieces floating apart for a few fleeting seconds, before both exploded. "You're in the wrong job," said Sterling, allowing them both a moment of levity. He then turned and scoured the opposite wall for the service hatch that would lead them to Deck 1, close to the bridge. He spotted it, then aimed the plasma rifle and fired 3 blasts in quick succession, melting the hatch and exposing the crawl space behind. "You could have just opened that the normal way," said Gunn, jumping down from the railgun control platform and frowning at the still smoldering remains of the access hatch. "Now I don't have to," said Sterling. He then spotted Gunn's plasma rifle on the deck and collected it. "Come on, let's finish this," he added, tossing the weapon to Gunn, who caught it. "And remember what I said." I know. If you get turned, then don't hesitate to put you down," Gunn said, cutting off Sterling mid-sentence. Then she pushed past him, giving him the evils as she did so. "Believe me, if you don't get off my ass, it'll be my pleasure." Chapter 5. Sterling unlocked the crawl space hatch on Deck 1 and gently pushed it open, just wide enough to peek through. The hatch led into a maintenance locker, close to the mission planning room, where Captain Blake had taken his own life barely more than an hour ago. So much had happened in the short space of time since, but Sterling knew that their toughest test still lay ahead. If the Sonara's objective was to steal the hammer, then the bridge would be where they'd concentrate their forces, and it would also be where any prisoners were held hostage, especially any that held command rank. "Do you think this Omega Directive applied to everyone of rank Lieutenant Commander and above?" whispered Gunn, following Sterling out into the tight space of the maintenance locker. "I hope not," replied Sterling, creeping up to the door and pressing his ear against it. He could hear sounds outside, but the thrum of the ship's mighty engines was still the dominant noise. "My guess is not, otherwise the Sonara would likely already have control of the hammer by now." Sterling was then jolted against the wall, and he instinctively grabbed hold of the door frame to steady himself. It took a moment for him to realize what had happened, by which point Gunn had already beat him to it. "The ship is turning to port," said Gunn, who was bracing herself on a storage rack to counteract the sudden acceleration of the vessel. "She's turning hard, too." The thrum of the hammer's mighty fusion reactors then began to build. Sterling had been on board the aged Dreadnought long enough to recognize the sound of the hammer being pushed to flank speed. The manner in which the deck plates vibrated and the way certain parts of the ship resonated in harmony with the beat of the engines would have meant nothing to most people. Yet to Sterling it was a form of language. The hammer was telling him that she was running, but to where he did not know for sure. At flank speed, we're maybe 15 minutes out from the nearest aperture that would allow the Sonara to surge the ship into the void between fleet and Sonaran space, said Sterling. There are no other fleet ships close enough to stop us, and certainly none that could cripple a dreadnought before it reaches the aperture. We have to regain control of the hammer before it surges, or we'll lose her forever. "And us, with her," commented Gunn pointedly. "Personally, I think that's more important." Sterling glared at Gunn, ready to pounce on her again for her inappropriate flippancy, but this time she seemed to recognize it herself and swiftly got back on topic. "How can you be sure the Sonaran have control and not us?" "From the duration and power of the turn, I'm 90% sure we're heading towards Sonaran territory," replied Sterling, again pressing his ear to the door. "How the hell can you know that?" asked Gunn. "All these ships have a unique language, you just have to know how to listen," said Sterling. He then glanced back at Gunn, eyebrows raised. "As one of the senior engineering officers, I would have thought you'd know that better than me." Gunn snorted. "Ships were never really my thing. I was designing and building new reactors and power systems before Fleet drafted me." She then tapped a knuckle on the wall of the maintenance space. "These giant tin cans do nothing for me." Sterling scowled at her again. "Can you not knock on the damn ship to let the Sonara know we're coming?" Gunn scowled, but bit her tongue, allowing Sterling to continue. "I can't tell if there's a squad of warriors waiting outside or if the coast is clear." "So we open the door and find out," said Gunn, adjusting the settings on her plasma rifle. Sterling nodded and configured his rifle to the maximum power setting. He knew he'd only get around 10 shots at that power level, but he wanted every shot to count. "I'll open the door on 3, he said to Gunn, stepping to the side and hovering his hand over the release button. Gunn moved into position, and as she did so, Sterling noticed that she had also set her weapon to maximum power. Despite her far too frequent glibness, when it came to crunch time, Aerial Gunn was someone Sterling was glad to have at his side. Sterling held up 3 fingers, ready to start the count. "Admiral Griffin, to anyone who can hear me, come back, over." Sterling tightened his hand into a fist, holding the count. "Did you hear that?" he said to Gunn, who nodded, then tapped her neural implant. "Admiral Griffin, to any officer cleared for command under the Omega Directive, come back, over." Sterling would have recognized Admiral Griffin's strident, authoritarian voice anywhere. However, the unique nature of their neural link provided an added level of clarity, as if the Admiral was physically in the room with them. It was a curious sensation to know with absolute certainty that something was true, without any physical evidence to back it up. "Admiral, this is Commander Sterling and Commander Gunn," said Sterling, nodding at Gunn, who tapped her neural interface to join the group channel. "Commander Sterling, we don't have long before the Sonara trace this connection, so just listen," the Admiral continued in her usual non-nonsense manner. "The Sonara have neural control of Commander Yanez and have used her to commandeer the hammer. Myself and 2 other officers are pinned down in the mission planning room, Deck 1. Get up here now so we can storm the bridge together and put an end to this." The neural link then abruptly terminated. Sterling was left with his mouth open, ready to reply, but without anyone to reply to. Then he noticed that Gunn was staring at him with a wary look in her eyes. He knew she was about to question what Admiral Griffin had just said, and headed her off before she got the chance. "Whatever you're about to say, save it," Sterling said. However, this time Gunn was not about to stay quiet. "Come on, Lucas," said Gunn despairingly. "We just so happened to arrive outside the mission planning room, and then just so happened to get a message from the Admiral. And nothing about that smells off to you?" Sterling knew what Gunn was thinking, but to him it was preposterous, and he had no interest in entertaining any notion that the Admiral's message was somehow part of an elaborate Sonaran deception. "The other turned crew we've seen have all acted like damn zombies, Ariel. What makes you think Griffin is different?" Gunn was about to answer, but he had no interest in hearing more of her fanciful theories and cut her off. "No more talk, Commander. We storm the mission planning room and get the Admiral, then we might actually have a chance of taking the bridge and ending this invasion." Gunn again tried to protest, but Sterling had already placed his hand over the door release. "When I open this door, you'd better be ready," Sterling snapped, causing Gunn to grit her teeth and raise her rifle. Sterling half expected her to aim it at him, but if Gunn did have any murderous urges, she had mercifully reined them in. Sterling slapped the door release, and they both sprang into action, moving into the corridor and sweeping the angles with their rifles. The corridor was clear, but the sound of Sonaran hisses told Sterling that the enemy was close by. A warrior turned the corner ahead of Sterling and he fired, blasting a hole straight through the alien's torso. Once again, the smell of burning alien flesh assaulted his senses, but he pressed on, advancing toward the door to the mission planning room directly ahead. Another Sonaran appeared, and Sterling felt a plasma blast rush past his face, so close that it singed his hair. Dropping to a crouch, he returned fire. However, unlike the alien's wayward shot, Sterling struck true, blasting the alien's head clean off. 2 more plasma bolts rang out behind him, but in the same way that he could understand the speed of the ship from the thrum of its engines, Sterling could also detect the difference between the alien weapons and their own rifles. "2 down, keep moving," he heard Gunn call out. Sterling moved on, not feeling any urge to look behind. Gunn quite literally had his back. Another Sonaran warrior jumped out at Sterling, but he managed to deflect the barrel of its rifle. The alien weapon discharged, and a plasma blast tore through the corridor wall, opening up a peephole into the captain's ready room. Sterling tried to shoot back, but the alien hammered the rifle from his grasp and smashed a leathery fist into his face. Sterling gritted his teeth and charged at the alien, grabbing it by its scaly neck and driving it into the door to the mission planning room. The Sonaran warrior reached for its serrated half-moon blade, but Sterling thumped 2 strikes into pressure points underneath the alien's arm, causing it to drop the blade. Hooking his leg behind the Sonaran, Sterling then threw it to the deck. The crack of the alien's skull resonated along the corridor, but Sterling wasn't done with the warrior yet. Raising his size 11 boot, he hammered his heel into the alien's face, over and over and over again, until its jaw and nose and eye sockets collapsed. He kept kicking until he felt hands pulling him away. Spinning around, he shoved away the figure that had grabbed him and raised his fists, eyes wild, before seeing that it was Gunn standing before him. "Holy hell, Lucas, I think you got it," said Gunn, staring down at the pulverized alien warrior, before looking at Sterling's clenched fists with fearful eyes. Sterling lowered his hands, forcing his breathing into a more regular rhythm, but his heart was still beating faster than the ship's engines. He then recovered his rifle, along with the Sonaran warrior's serrated blade. "Not now, Ariel," Sterling said, realizing that Gunn was still staring at him like he was possessed by the devil. "Fine, but you can bet your ass we're talking about that later when this is all over," Gunn hit back, spinning around to cover the corridor to the rear. "Now get that damn door open and let's finish this." Chapter 6. Commander Sterling examined the door to the mission planning room, but unsurprisingly it was locked. He pressed and held the release button, but the door refused to recognize him. "Command override, open this damn door," Sterling said, but the soothing voice of the computer was conspicuous by its absence. "They must have manually locked it or jammed it somehow," Sterling said, picking up a discarded Sonaran plasma rifle and reconfiguring it to cutting mode. He then glanced back at Gunn, but she seemed a million light years away. "Hey, are you still with me?" he added, slapping her on the shoulder. The sudden contact made Gunn jump, though Sterling couldn't be sure if she was shocked at being slapped or just shocked at being touched by him. "What? Sorry, I zoned out for a moment then," Gunn said, though Sterling could tell she had been staring down at the alien warrior he had stomped to death earlier. "I said back up, I'm going to cut through the door," Sterling replied, trying not to meet Gunn's eyes. It was clear he'd freaked her out, and he was sorry for that part at least, if not the part about killing the alien warrior. It was the Sonara that had started the war, and over the course of decades killed millions. He wasn't going to shed a tear for one of their warriors, especially not one that had attacked his ship and killed his crew. Gunn stepped away from the door, though she was still wearing a troubled frown, and Sterling took aim at the door. Squeezing and holding the trigger, a narrow beam of focused plasma emanated from the alien rifle and started cutting through the lock. Molten metal bubbled from the area he targeted, and a few seconds later he was through. Resting the alien rifle against the wall, Sterling turned to slide the door open, but it wouldn't budge. "Are you going to help or just stand there?" said Sterling through gritted teeth. "I thought brute force was your specialty," Gunn hit back in a not very subtle dig at Sterling's earlier violence. However, before Sterling could respond, Gunn joined in the effort, and finally they heaved the door back into its mounting. Gunn stepped away and aimed her rifle through the opening, but the room was dark and still, and appeared to be empty. Sterling picked up the alien rifle he'd rested against the wall and cautiously moved ahead, but he'd barely taken a step into the room before he was met by a thumping right hand from someone hiding just inside the door. The blow momentarily stunned him and he dropped the rifle, but he managed to raise a guard before another hard shot drove him back into the corridor. His vision cleared, and through the gap in his raised arms he saw a man in fleet uniform staring at him with glassy, vacant eyes. Gunn now rushed forward, but the man caught her weapon and tore it out of her grasp with freakish strength. 3 more fleet crew then came at them from out of the shadows, none of them armed. With only a split second to make a call, Sterling dropped low and recovered his alien rifle, shooting from the hip and burning a hole straight through 2 of the turned crew. The 3rd fleet officer then grabbed Sterling's rifle and tore it from his grasp with the same ease with which Gunn had been disarmed. However, instead of using the weapon on him, the turned officer, who Sterling didn't recognize, raised it above his head like a club. Sterling wasted no time drawing the Sonaran half-moon blade that he'd taken from an earlier enemy and slashing the serrated edge across the gut of the officer. The man's stomach was sliced open, but unbelievably the attack didn't stop him, and the rifle still came swinging towards Sterling's head. He ducked at the last moment and rolled into the mission planning room. The rifle thumped against the wall and smashed into pieces from the sheer power of the impact. Sterling recovered his footing and swung again with the blade. This time he sliced through the back of the turned officer's right knee, cutting muscle and tendons and sending the man crashing down to the deck. Searching around him for something more substantial to use as a weapon, Sterling grabbed one of the high-backed conference chairs and lifted it, adrenaline fueling his own muscles to near superhuman levels. The chair came crashing down on the officer's head and neck, and the man finally remained still. Muffled cries then alerted Sterling to Gunn. She was on her back with a female fleet officer kneeling on top of her, one hand pressed to her throat. However, it was what the other hand was doing that caused Sterling's gut to tighten into a knot. The familiar wrench-shaped neural device was being pressed to Gunn's head. Sterling charged forward and threw the female officer away from Gunn. Spotting Gunn's rifle on the deck, he picked it up and blasted the woman twice, once in the gut and once in the chest. However, despite the weapon being set to maximum power, somehow the officer was still alive. Sterling watched in amazement as she peered down at the holes that had been burned through her flesh with confused, vacant eyes. Sterling could see straight through her, yet the woman was still standing. It was surreal and disturbing, but all the same, Sterling couldn't look away. Then the woman finally collapsed and became rigid, as if she'd been flash frozen in liquid nitrogen. Sterling forced himself to look away, then checked that the corridor outside was still clear before dropping down at Gunn's side. "Hey, talk to me, Ariel. Are you okay?" he said, quickly checking her over. Other than some cuts and scrapes where the turned female officer's fingernails had dug into her flesh, she seemed fine. Sterling's pulse raced as he then checked Gunn's neural implant, though there was no sign of corruption, and he let out an audible sigh of relief. "Are you going to help me up or just lie on me like that damn zombie?" said Gunn, pushing herself into a sitting position. Sterling offered her his hand and hauled Gunn back to her feet. She then patted him on the chest and smiled. "Thanks, by the way. You might sometimes be as scary as these turned freaks, but I'm glad you're on my side." "Thank me later if I'm still breathing," replied Sterling, handing the rifle back to Gunn. "Now watch the corridor while I try to find the Admiral." Commander Sterling hurried through the mission planning room, pushing aside chairs and tables that had been toppled over during earlier struggles. He could now see blast marks in the walls, and there was also some blood, but the body of Captain Blake, or what remained of it, was missing. He moved over to the door to the breakout room and unlocked it. The door slid back, and before he knew it, Sterling was hit in the face by an object thrown from inside the room. Stumbling back, he raised his guard, Sonaran blade in hand, and saw the Admiral advance, flanked by two other officers that Sterling couldn't see clearly. The Admiral was holding a metal panel in her grasp, while a similar panel lay on the floor by Sterling's feet. He guessed this was what she had thrown into his face earlier. "Show me your implant, Commander! Do it now!" Admiral Griffin barked. The Admiral was a force of nature, and Sterling had turned his head and smoothed back his hair before he'd even realized he'd done it. It was like the Admiral possessed the magical power to make him do whatever she liked just by commanding it. Admiral Griffin didn't need a neural control device to get her own way. "It's me, Admiral. I'm all here. Just about," said Sterling, waiting for the Admiral to appear satisfied that he hadn't been turned. He knew Admiral Griffin reasonably well, and she liked him, at least as much as she liked anyone, which wasn't much. The Admiral then tossed the metal plate to the floor and glanced over at Gunn. "Is it just the two of you?" she asked, directing the question to Sterling. "Yes, sir, I'm afraid so," replied Sterling. He then looked behind Admiral Griffin to the two other officers who were flanking her. He could now see them clearly, but Sterling did not know either of them. However, both wore full commander's rank insignia on their collars. Sterling frowned as he studied their faces, though neither of them had even so much as looked in his direction since emerging from the breakout room. Sterling knew every commander on the ship, and the fact he'd never seen these officers before gave him pause. "We have no time to waste. We must retake the bridge," continued Admiral Griffin, oblivious to Sterling's suspicions. She opened an auxiliary weapons locker and removed 3 plasma pistols, handing 2 of them to her escorts. While the Admiral worked, Gunn had moved beside Sterling, her face also betraying the appearance of confusion and suspicion. "Who are those guys?" she said, whispering so that the others couldn't hear her. "I don't know," replied Sterling. For once, he didn't feel the urge to reprimand Gunn for her naturally suspicious nature. However, given their situation, he wasn't sure what choice they had other than to accept the presence of these 2 unfamiliar officers. "Keep an eye on them, though," he added under his breath. "I'll keep 2 on them," Gunn replied, folding her arms across her chest. "You are unarmed, Commander," Admiral Griffin said, holding out another plasma pistol to Sterling. "You will need this." "Thank you, Admiral," Sterling said, taking the weapon and arming it. "My rifle got smashed by one of the turned officers we fought getting to you," he added, glancing back at the demolished weapon on the deck beside the dead officer. "The Sonara neural control device temporarily boosts human physiology, giving uncommon strength and resilience to those who are affected," the Admiral said. She marched toward the door that led to the main corridor outside. Her 2 escorts continued to shadow her, though still neither had said a word. "However, the Sonara only need to control us for long enough to deactivate the neural command safeguards, which is precisely what has happened to this ship. We have little time left to act before they surge us into the void. If that happens, a dozen Sonaran ships will be waiting to take full control of the Hammer. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that this cannot be allowed to happen, Commander." "No, sir, I understand the stakes," Sterling replied confidently. The Admiral moved ahead, but Sterling noticed that Gunn was hanging back, watching the other 2 commanders like a hawk. Then Sterling's own unease got the better of him, and he felt compelled to find out who the other officers were. "Commander Sterling, good to meet you," Sterling said, striding up to the closest of the 2 unarmed commanders and offering him his hand. "And you are?" "These are my aide-de-camp," Admiral Griffin interrupted before the officer Sterling had addressed could answer. However, the man appeared to have no intention of answering Sterling anyway. The officer hadn't even met his eyes. We can save the introductions till later, the Admiral went on, cutting off any further avenue of inquiry. Sterling glanced back at Gunn, and he could tell that she was burning with questions and doubts, but she had the presence of mind to hold her tongue. Admiral Griffin was not one to tolerate insubordination. There are 6 Sonaran warriors on the bridge, including their commander, Griffin went on, addressing the group. The officer who has turned over command of the vessel is called Commander Welsh. She will be at the main con and is our primary target. While Sterling didn't know the 2 men standing beside him, he did know Commander Welsh. She was the Hammer's chief medical officer and a close friend of Gunn's. Sterling didn't know a single person on the ship who didn't like Naomi Welsh, and felt bad that it was her the Sonarans had coerced into handing over control of the ship. Commander Sterling will eliminate Commander Welsh while the rest of us target the other Sonarans on the bridge, Griffin announced. We go in hard and fast. I want this all over in a matter of seconds. The Admiral's order was given casually, as if she had simply asked Sterling to fetch her a cup of tea. Gunn had often criticized Sterling for being cold and detached, but the aloof manner in which the Admiral had given Sterling the duty of executing a fellow officer and friend was chilling. He glanced over to Gunn, who looked ready to explode, but he shook his head at her. If Gunn protested, then the next distasteful duty Sterling would likely have to perform would be arresting and restraining her. Is everyone clear on their duties? Admiral Griffin then asked, although it was not a question that any sane officer would say no to. Yes, sir, said Sterling without hesitation, his voice chorusing with the 2 unnamed commanders. He then looked to Gunn, urging her to agree with a flash of his eyes and raising of his eyebrows. Yes, Admiral, I am clear on our orders, Gunn finally replied, but Sterling could hear the dissension in her voice, and from the narrowing of the Admiral's eyes, it had not gone unnoticed by her either. Then you take point, Lieutenant Commander, Griffin continued, waving Gunn forward. Sterling followed Gunn with his eyes as she trudged ahead of the party, looking like she was walking the Green Mile. The 2 unnamed officers then moved out before the Admiral gestured for Sterling to go next. He stepped through the door and advanced toward the bridge, weapon raised. Griffin appeared at his side. Are you prepared to do your duty, Commander Sterling? She asked, keeping her keen green eyes locked on the door to the main bridge. I am, sir, replied Sterling, again without hesitation. I take it you know Commander Welsh? The Admiral asked, maintaining her cool, unemotional delivery. I do, Admiral, said Sterling, though he considered it an odd question to ask in that moment. Everyone knows Naomi, she's well liked. The group reached the door and they took their positions, ready to breach. Griffin raised her hand in readiness to give the order, but then glanced across to Sterling. She is no longer your friend, Commander. You understand that, don't you? Sterling met the Admiral's eyes. They were the eyes of a woman who had seen more war and loss than Sterling could possibly comprehend in his short 31 years. Admiral Griffin had been 10 when the Sonara War started, 16 when she first joined Fleet, and 19 when she first saw battle. Yet the pugnacious Admiral was still here and still fighting. If they were to survive, if the human race was to survive, Sterling knew he had to be just like her, or the war could continue for another 5 decades. I won't hesitate, Admiral, he said. You can count on me. Chapter 7. Admiral Griffin gave the order to attack. Then Sterling and Gunn stormed onto the bridge, weapons raised. However, no sooner had they set foot over the threshold than the door slammed shut behind them, trapping Griffin and her 2 aides-de-camp in the corridor outside. Sterling cursed but stayed focused. Despite their assault party being reduced to only himself and Gunn, the Sonaran invaders on the bridge had still been taken by surprise, giving him a crucial advantage. Sterling immediately looked for his primary target, Commander Welsh, but his view of her was blocked by a wall of Sonaran warriors. The aliens were now alerted to his presence, which meant he had no choice but to shoot his way to her. It's just us 2, Sterling called out to Gunn over the rasp of his plasma pistol. 2 warriors dropped, but more moved in front of the con, forming a shield in front of the turned commander. Gunn cursed, then darted along the left wall of the bridge, shooting 2 Sonaran invaders before being pinned down. A plasma blast ripped past Sterling's head, but he didn't flinch, shooting the attacker in the torso, then diving for cover as more plasma blasts tore through the air. Sterling returned fire, driving the aliens back and giving Gunn an opportunity to advance. She moved toward the con, killing another 2 warriors, but the final Sonaran invaders were still trying to shield Commander Welsh. Sterling assumed they must also have known that without their human puppet, they would lose control of the hammer. The aliens seemed willing to sacrifice themselves in order to ensure the ship surged into the void. Sterling glanced at the view screen and saw that the aperture was fast approaching. Despite plasma bolts flashing all around him and consoles erupting into sparks and flames, he had no choice but to press the attack. Charging forward, Sterling unleashed a flurry of plasma fire at the remaining alien warriors. He took a hit to the shoulder but pushed on through the pain. Gunn also advanced, catching the Sonarans in a crossfire. Sterling took another hit, but his combat vest absorbed the bulk of the energy. Even so, his chest burned and the pain threatened to overwhelm him, but he continued to fire, and a split second later the Sonarans were all dead. All bar one. A final alien warrior remained. It stood behind Commander Naomi Welsh with its leathery arm around her neck and a plasma pistol to her head. Sterling could hear its raspy breathing, faster and more labored than usual, yet he could still determine nothing about the alien's state of mind from its round yellow eyes and unyielding expression. However, if the alien believed that Sterling would not shoot, it was sorely mistaken. He gritted his teeth and aimed his pistol at Naomi's head. The commander's eyes were glassy and vacant, like all of the other turned humans Sterling had seen, yet they were also staring straight at him. Sterling swallowed hard and was about to squeeze the trigger when Gunn jumped in front of him and blocked his shot. "Lucas, wait! We can still save her!" Gunn shouted. She had her back to Sterling and was training the barrel of her plasma rifle at the alien. The Sonaran's eyes flicked to Gunn and its raspy breathing intensified. "Ariel, get the hell out of the way!" Sterling yelled, trying to sidestep around her in order to get a firing angle, but Gunn made sure to match his moves. She then removed one hand from the plasma rifle and drew her pistol. However, instead of aiming it at Commander Welsh or the alien warrior, Gunn aimed it at Sterling instead. "We can still help her," Gunn hit back. "We have to try, Lucas. We can't just murder her in cold blood." Sterling glanced past Gunn and looked at Commander Welsh. The commander was physically tethered to the captain's console in the center of the bridge by a wire inserted into a spidery, corrupted implant. Then he glanced at the view screen. The flashing beacons that marked the boundary of the aperture were now visible. If he didn't act soon, then the hammer would jump into the void between Fleet and Sonaran space, where hundreds more alien warriors lay in wait. "Ariel, she's gone," Sterling said, still trying to get a clean shot at the turned commander. "Now get out of the way, that's an order!" Gunn shook her head and moved closer to the con. The Sonaran warrior remained behind Commander Welsh, occasionally flicking its egg-shaped eyes to the screen, watching the aperture creep closer. "To hell with the Admiral, and to hell with the Omega Directive," Gunn spat. "I'm not going to let you kill Naomi. I'm not going to let you murder my friend. Help me." The whispered plea had escaped from the lips of Commander Welsh. Sterling scowled at the turned officer, and for the first time he saw a flicker of life behind her eyes. "Help," Commander Welsh said again, her voice weak and anguished. Then she slipped away and her eyes turned glassy again, as if dropping into a waking coma. "I told you," Gunn said, moving closer to the Sonaran, this time with the rifle aimed high and her other hand raised as if in surrender. The alien peered back at Gunn, though there was nothing about its leathery features that suggested it had understood Gunn's intentions. Suddenly, the Sonaran released Commander Welsh and grabbed Gunn, wrapping its long fingers around her neck. Sterling watched in horror as the warrior clasped a neural device around her head, then used Gunn as a shield. Its yellow eyes peered over Gunn's shoulder and a series of waspish hissing sounds escaped the alien's lips. These were then mixed in with sharper, more grating sounds that were equally incomprehensible. Sterling cursed and cast his eyes to the view screen again. The ship would surge in less than a minute. Gritting his teeth, Sterling aimed his pistol at Ariel Gunn. Her implant now bore the telltale signs of corruption, an irregular pattern that extended around the neural device and crawled across the side of her face, like the legs of a wolf spider. "Ariel, get out of the way," Sterling implored her, hoping that somehow his words would reach the willful officer. However, in his heart he already knew she was lost, and he knew what he had to do. Squeezing the trigger, Sterling shot Lieutenant Commander Ariel Gunn straight between her eyes. With his pistol set to maximum power, Gunn's head was blown clean off. Her decapitated corpse then dropped to the deck like a grotesque shop mannequin. Sterling felt guilt and revulsion stab his insides, but his task was not yet done. Squeezing the trigger again, he sent another plasma blast rippling across the bridge. It sunk into the gut of Commander Welsh, penetrating through her body and striking the alien that was now cowering behind her. The Sonaran hissed and returned fire, but his shot was wayward. Sterling fired again and again, each blast cutting through the body of Commander Welsh and dealing more damage to the alien. This time the warrior dropped to its knees and Sterling advanced, stepping up onto the con. The Sonaran peered up at him, hands wrapped around its injured body. It met Sterling's eyes and hissed at him, the rasping sound of its breathing growing weaker by the second. Perhaps it was cursing him, Sterling thought, or perhaps it was begging for its life. He didn't know, and he didn't care. Pressing his pistol to the side of the Sonaran's head, Sterling fired a final shot, blasting the alien warrior at point-blank range. The invaders were all dead. Yet, incredibly, Commander Welsh was still standing, despite having 3 holes burned clean through her body. "Commander?" turning the woman to face him. "Naomi, can you hear me?" He tried again, disconnecting the cable that linked the officer to the captain's console. "Naomi, it's Lucas," Sterling continued. "It's okay. You're okay now." Commander Welsh finally met Sterling's eyes. She then peered down at the plasma burns that had cut holes through her flesh. Pressing her fingers into the gaping, cauterized pits in her gut and sides, the officer then lifted her head to Sterling, wearing an expression of utter confusion. She opened her mouth to speak, but then suddenly collapsed to the deck, as if she were a puppet that just had its strings cut. Sterling sighed, then stepped up to the con and rested his hands on the captain's console. The aperture was directly ahead, but he still had time to prevent the surge. "Computer recognized Sterling, Lucas, rank commander," he said, anxiously tapping his foot on the deck. "Initiate command override and give me control of Fleet Dreadnought Hammer." "Welcome, Commander Sterling. The Omega Directive is in effect. You have the con," the computer replied, sounding as breezy and unconcerned as always. "Deactivate surge field and come to a full stop," Sterling said. Because of his neural interface, he technically didn't need to speak to the computer at all, but he wanted to be doubly sure it heard him and complied. Sterling then linked his neural interface to the con and input a number of additional commands non-verbally, including unlocking the door to the bridge. "Command acknowledged. Search field deactivated. Coming to a full stop," the computer confirmed cheerfully. Sterling blew out a heavy sigh, then rested back onto the console, a sudden wave of relief washing over him. Then he caught sight of Gunn's headless body on the deck, and any sense of relief and accomplishment vanished. Yet the overriding emotion he felt was not guilt, but anger. Gunn hadn't needed to die. If she would have just obeyed the order, she'd still be alive. "You damn fool," Sterling said to the headless body. The door to the bridge then swooshed open, and Admiral Griffin walked in, flanked by the 2 unnamed commanders. Her pistol was holstered at her side, and she looked as unconcerned as the computer had sounded. "Admiral, the ship is secured and the surge field is deactivated. I have ordered a full stop," said Sterling, straightening to attention, though he felt suddenly weary. "I regret the loss of Commander Gunn and Commander Welsh." Admiral Griffin glanced down at the 2 bodies, though she remained unconcerned and also entirely unmoved by the sight of the dead officers. "Congratulations, Commander Sterling," said Admiral Griffin, stepping onto the captain's command platform. She then kicked the dead Sonaran warrior off the con with her boot. The act was as casual as brushing fluff off her collar. "Computer, cancel Omega Directive and reset," Admiral Griffin then said. The alarms and flashing alert lights on the bridge then all silenced, and the ship returned to its standard operating posture as if nothing had happened. Sterling frowned at the Admiral, but she had already turned her attention to the 2 unnamed commanders. "Have the Sabre and Achilles form up with us, then resume course to Outpost 12, Griffin ordered. Her 2 aides-de-camp both responded immediately, taking up stations on the bridge. The door to the bridge opened again, and a team of fleet officers and crew moved inside. Each of them wore a silver stripe across their dark navy blue uniforms, which Sterling had never seen before. The crew then set to work, cleaning up the bodies and beginning repairs on the numerous damaged sections of the bridge. "Admiral, what the hell is going on here?" said Sterling, foregoing any of the usual formalities and courtesies he'd typically extend to the Admiral. Admiral Griffin turned to Sterling and pressed her hands to the small of her back. "What's going on is that you passed the test, Commander," she said coolly. She then pointed to the headless body of Lieutenant Commander Ariel Gunn. "I am afraid that she did not." Sterling opened his mouth, but there were no words to express how he was feeling. The bridge doors swooshed open again, and Sterling turned to see Captain Blake walk in, very much alive. He peered back at Admiral Griffin, mouth still open, but he was no less dumbstruck. "You have the con, Captain," said Admiral Griffin. Captain Blake acknowledged the Admiral's order, then stepped onto the platform. Like the Admiral's aide-de-camp, the captain didn't meet Sterling's eyes. He then felt a hand on his shoulder and discovered that Admiral Griffin had finally turned her attention back to him. "Come with me, Commander Sterling," she said, her voice firm, but somehow also more encouraging. "We have much to discuss." Chapter 8. Admiral Griffin poured 2 long measures of Calvados from a teardrop-shaped bottle, then slid one of the glasses across the table to Sterling. They were sitting in the captain's ready room, with the Hammer en route to Outpost 12. It was like the events of the last couple of hours had not happened, and Sterling was genuinely unsure as to whether he'd just dreamt it all. "You must have 1,000 questions, Commander, so let me just cut to the chase and see how many I can cover," Admiral Griffin began. She drank from her tulip-shaped glass and cleared her throat. "The Sonaran neural control device is real," she continued, starting by answering a question that was a long way down Sterling's list of things he wanted to know. "Using this device, the aliens have been able to capture a number of fleet ships and outposts, including this vessel's sister ship, and turn them against us. On top of this, the Sonara have adapted their tactics. They appear to have understood how we operate. Perhaps they even understand our language." Admiral Griffin then snorted a laugh, but it merely highlighted her frustration rather than amusement. "Yet after 50 damn years, we still don't know which of their hisses means hello and which means goodbye." She sighed, then took another sip of Calvados. "We're losing the war, Commander. That's the top and bottom of it. And to win, we need to change our tactics too. For that, we must become more like the Sonara, more ruthless. And for that to happen, we need a special breed of officers, captains that won't hesitate to do what needs to be done, even if that means killing fleet crew that the Sonara have turned against us. You have just proved yourself to be one of those officers." Sterling ran his hand over his head and rubbed his buzz-cut hair. He tried to process what the Admiral had just said, then realized she had just presented more questions than she had given him answers. "Admiral, with respect, you haven't told me a damn thing about what just happened out there," Sterling replied, struggling to keep a lid on his anger. He then jabbed a finger at the door leading onto the bridge. "I just killed my friend, and from what I can tell, we were never in any real danger. And now you're telling me that this was all just some dumb test?" Admiral Griffin slammed her palm onto the desk, causing some of the Calvados in Sterling's glass to spill over the side. "Watch your tone, Commander," she snapped. "Do not forget who you are speaking to." However, Sterling was not about to roll over. Not this time. "I know who I'm speaking to, Admiral, and you damn well owe me an explanation." Admiral Griffin looked ready to fight back, but unusually for her, the cantankerous officer appeared to back down. She sighed, then topped up her glass from the tear-shaped bottle. "The Omega Directive is a test, yes, but it is far from dumb," she began again, sounding more composed, though no less stern. "In fact, it is the most important test the fleet has." Sterling frowned, still not following. "A test of who is willing to kill?" "It's a test of nerve, Commander," Admiral Griffin replied. "It's a test of who has what it takes to do the unthinkable, when doing the unthinkable may be all that stands between us and oblivion at the hands of the Sonara." Sterling rubbed the bridge of his nose with his finger and thumb. He was beginning to understand the true nature of the Omega Directive. Fleet wanted to know how someone would react when pushed to the limit, and the way to achieve that was to push people for real. "We tried simulating the Omega Directive in a holo trainer, and we tried live simulations using actors and training weapons," Griffin continued, filling the void left by Sterling's silence. "But it's not the same. The officers who passed those tests, whether they realized it was a test at the time or not, all failed to step up in the field. The Omega Directive has to be real. It's the only way we can uncover the officers we need." Sterling picked up the glass of Calvados and drained it in one. He'd never tried Calvados before, but the liquor slipped down his throat so quickly he barely tasted it. Still, the burn of the alcohol felt good. So the Sonera I fought were real? Asked Sterling, feeling the Calvados warm his gut. Yes, prisoners that we conveniently allowed to escape, replied the Admiral. The same is true for the ancient Sonaran destroyers we let loose. They were ships that were captured and impounded decades ago. Admiral Griffin's lip curled into a sadistic smile. That part of the test was new, but I think it worked well. Sterling snorted a laugh, but didn't reply, though he had to admit that blasting the 2 old alien destroyers with a railgun was entertaining. The top 4 decks of the Hammer were secured in order to run the Omega Directive, Griffin went on, and we made sure that any crew not selected for the trial were moved to the lower decks first. Sterling shook his head. If the Sonera had been real, then he assumed that all of the fleet crew that died were real too. You allowed all those men and women to be killed just to run a test? He asked. Sterling wasn't afraid to send crew to their deaths if the mission required it, but to sacrifice loyal, trained personnel just for a trial seemed unthinkable. From the look in the Admiral's eyes, she had appeared to sense his disquiet. You think the test to be inhumane, Commander? She said. Perhaps criminal. You're telling me it's not? Replied Sterling, almost laughing from the absurdity of the question. The truth is that the Omega Directive is inhumane, Griffin answered, surprising Sterling with her honesty. But our enemy is not human, and our enemy kills thousands of fleet crew every day. In this test, we lost 52 souls, but gained an Omega officer, you. That, in the end, is more important. The difference is that the thousands who died on the front line died fighting a real threat, while those here died for nothing, Sterling hit back. Am I really worth that sacrifice? That remains to be seen, Commander, the Admiral replied, though the tone of her response was darker and more sinister than Sterling would have liked. But in time, if you again rise to the challenge, the sacrifices made here will help to save many millions more. Sterling sighed and rubbed his head again. What about Captain Blake? He said, remembering the image of the captain blasting his own head off. I saw him die, but then stroll onto the bridge like nothing had happened. Admiral Griffin took another sip of Calvados, then crossed her legs. Unlike Sterling, she still appeared to be relaxed and entirely unconcerned with the loss of life on the Hammer. Captain Blake temporarily transferred backup control to the auxiliary bridge on Deck 5. After his little performance for your benefit, of course. That part was an illusion. Sterling grunted and shook his head again. Lucky for him, he said, grabbing the bottle of Calvados and topping up his glass. Less so for Naomi and Ariel. At that moment, he didn't know what he hated more. The fact that he'd been forced into killing Ariel as part of some elaborate game, or that Captain Blake was still alive. Gunn was right, you are a cold-hearted bastard, Sterling thought. If they had followed orders and acted without hesitation or sentimentality, as you did, they would still be alive, replied Griffin. Her response sent a chill down Sterling's spine, as if a drop of ice-cold rainwater had just splashed onto his neck. However, more alarming was the fact he found himself agreeing with Griffin's assessment. He contemplated for a moment whether that made him a bad person, or just a cold pragmatist like the Admiral. Maybe it makes me both, he wondered. Let me ask you one question, Commander, and we will soon discover if we have an understanding, said Admiral Griffin. Go on, said Sterling, both intrigued and more than a little anxious. With the benefit of hindsight, would you have done anything differently? Sterling thought for a moment, and realized that he would have done one thing differently, and while it was not an answer he was proud of, it was the truth. I would have put Ariel down the moment she stopped me from shooting Commander Welsh, Sterling said, feeling slightly sick from his own admission of this fact. The Admiral's eyes widened, and Sterling felt he needed to clarify his answer so that he didn't come across as a complete monster. Not that he imagined Griffin would care even if he was. I don't mean kill her, just wound her badly enough to put her out of action. Maybe then she'd still be alive, not that she would have ever spoken to me again. But the key point is that she jeopardized the mission and I shouldn't have let her. Admiral Griffin nodded, but didn't respond. She then watched Sterling pick up the glass of Calvados that he'd poured himself earlier and empty the contents down his throat. She waited for Sterling to set down the glass, watching him like a hawk. He fully expected her to bark at him for pouring himself a measure of her prized drink without asking. However, the Admiral appeared to be cutting him some slack. Sterling considered this to be perhaps the most unexpected event to have occurred since he'd been rudely awoken in his cabin. Considering what had just gone down, that was saying something, he realized. "I don't undertake these trials lightly, Commander," Admiral Griffin eventually continued. "I mourn the loss of life, just as I mourn the thousands of other fleet officers and crew that die every day. But these sacrifices are necessary if we are to win the war." "Please forgive my boldness, Admiral. I'm just struggling to process this all right now," replied Sterling. The Calvados had helped to calm his nerves, but now he just felt physically and mentally numb. "You will understand in time, Commander," said Admiral Griffin. She then stood up and moved around the side of the table. Sterling stood also, straightening to attention as he did so. It was an automatic reaction, but one that showed that his respect for protocol and the chain of command had not diminished. He was still Fleet whether he liked it or not. Then the Admiral's next action stunned him again. "I hereby promote you to Captain, with all the rights and privileges thereto," said Admiral Griffin, pressing her thumb and forefinger to Sterling's collar. When she removed her hand again, there was an additional gold bar beside the 3 that had already been there. Sterling peered at it in astonishment, again wondering whether he was still asleep and dreaming. "Report to Docking Bay 4 immediately," the Admiral continued. "A shuttle is waiting to take you to your next destination, where you will be briefed fully." "Briefed on what? Where am I going?" asked Sterling, still in a state of shock. "You are going to your first command, Captain," said Admiral Griffin with a rare touch of brightness to her voice. Sterling even thought he detected the hint of a genuine smile, though he probably imagined it. "Welcome to the Omega Force, Captain Sterling. I know you'll do us proud." Admiral Griffin held out her hand and Sterling shook it, not knowing what else to do. The Admiral then sat back down at the desk, activated the computer console, and began working. Sterling's mouth fell open again, but not for the first time. No words came out. Admiral Griffin paused from her work and glanced up at him. "You are dismissed, Captain," she said, clearly perplexed as to why Sterling was still standing in front of her. Captain Lucas Sterling closed his mouth, then turned on his heels and walked out onto the bridge. The bodies of the Sonaran warriors, along with what had remained of Gunn and Welsh, were gone. The damage from wayward plasma blasts was still being patched up, but overall everything appeared normal. Captain Blake was still standing at the con, and he glanced back at Sterling as he headed for the exit. The captain shot him a respectful nod, displaying none of the personal disdain for Sterling that typically shone in the man's eyes. Captain Blake then simply turned back to his console, hands pressed to the small of his back. "Now I've seen it all," thought Sterling, moving off the bridge and entering the elevator. "Docking Bay 4, he said to the computer. "Docking Bay 4 acknowledged, Captain Sterling," the computer replied. As usual, the computer's voice was the only constant in what had been a whirlwind of incomprehensible events that Sterling had yet to process. He had a feeling that his life was not about to get any simpler. Chapter 9. Sterling walked across the deck of Docking Bay 4 and saw a young officer standing in front of a shuttle with the name Invictus painted on the side. He peered around the docking bay, quickly noting that every other shuttle and fighter on the platform was part of the Hammer's regular complement. He continued toward the out-of-place vessel, watching the officer keenly as the young officer was watching him back. "Captain Sterling, I'm Ensign Kieran Keller," said the man, saluting. Sterling returned the salute, and the man lowered his hand sharply to his side. "I'm your new helmsman, sir. If you're ready to get on board, I'll take you to the briefing." Sterling threw his hands out wide. "I've just come straight from the Admiral, Ensign Keller. I haven't even packed." "Your personal effects have already been loaded on board, sir," the young officer replied. "Everything else you need will be in your quarters on the Invictus." Sterling huffed a laugh. "I don't suppose you can tell me what the hell is going on, Keller? I feel like I'm in a daze." This comment seemed to resonate with Keller, though he was also clearly trying hard not to show it. "I'm afraid not, sir. My orders were to travel here and pick you up." "Where did you travel from, Ensign?" asked Sterling, wondering where Admiral Griffin had found this other new member of the Omega Force. "Until a couple of days ago, I was crew on the Valhalla," Ensign Keller replied. "Until the Omega Directive, anyway." "Strange couple of days, I bet, huh?" said Sterling. Ensign Keller's face became a little paler, and he forced down a dry swallow. "You have no idea, sir." Sterling smiled, then slapped Keller on the shoulder. "Don't count on it, Ensign," he said. Then Sterling boarded the shuttle and closed the door. Keller jumped into the pilot's seat a moment later and maneuvered the shuttle into the launch pod. The sound of the young officer's voice then filtered into his mind as Ensign Keller communicated with launch control through his neural link. Sterling let the words wash over him, welcoming the chatter like an old friend. Even though he'd only been without neural comms for a few hours, the absence of voices felt like a missing limb. The shuttle burst out of the launch pod and began to fly along the length of the giant Hammer-class Dreadnought, which had been Sterling's home for the last 4 years. 2 frigates were flying in formation with the behemoth vessel. Sterling assumed that these were the Sabre and Achilles, the ships Admiral Griffin had mentioned earlier. Neither were especially illustrious vessels, and he felt his spirits sink, wondering if one of these 2 old frigates were to be his new command. Then, ahead of the Hammer, Sterling caught sight of another ship, almost invisible against the blackness of space. It was 1/10 the size of the Hammer, but somehow it looked even meaner. Sterling had never seen a ship like it. "Is that the Invictus?" asked Sterling. "Yes, sir," replied Keller. There was a sense of pride in his voice, like he was talking about a classic car that he'd restored by hand. "I've only been on board for a day, but that was enough to know that she's a beauty, all right." Sterling nodded. "If that's beauty, then we must be the beasts," he commented more to himself than to Keller. "Do you know what our mission is, sir?" asked Keller. He seemed to immediately regret his question. "Sorry if that's impertinent, sir. It's just been a strange few days, like you said." "I tend to be someone who speaks my mind, Ensign, so I don't begrudge that trait in my officers either," Sterling replied. My officers, he thought, shaking his head, still struggling to believe what was happening to him. "And you don't need to sir me every other word, by the way. This isn't officer school." "Sorry, sir," replied Keller, wincing as he realized his mistake. However, the young man knew well enough to stay quiet, rather than try to apologize and dig himself further into a hole. A few seconds later, Keller plucked up the courage to speak again. "So, do you know our mission?" Sterling looked at Keller. He clearly wasn't a nervous man, and he didn't look as fresh-faced as his rank and obvious youth suggested. There was a ruggedness to his appearance. Whatever test they'd thrown at him, he'd obviously passed, Sterling realized, and that meant he was a rung above most ensigns in the fleet. "Our mission is to win the war, Ensign Keller," said Sterling, trying to channel some of Admiral Griffin's authoritarian bite and icy coolness. "Whatever it takes. Whatever the cost." "Whatever the cost?" Ensign Keller answered, looking at Sterling out of the corner of his eye. "Is that going to be a problem, Ensign?" asked Sterling. Keller shook his head without hesitation. "No, sir, not for me." Sterling studied the young man's face for any subtle change that would give away his fears, doubts, or insecurities. However, the officer did not twitch so much as a muscle. Sterling nodded, then sat back and peered out at the Invictus again, wondering if this new ship was going to be as tough and as pitiless as its crew. Then his thoughts turned to Ariel Gunn, and he tried to picture her face, but it was already a blur. He remembered her standing in his way on the bridge of the Hammer, and him shooting her in the head. At the time, he felt guilt and shame. Now, he felt nothing. "Fleet loves cold-hearted bastards like you," he recalled Gunn saying to him. She had been right about that. "Good," Sterling replied to Keller as the shuttle entered the docking bay of the Invictus. "Because it won't be a problem for me either." Space is cold, but the heart of an Omega captain is colder still. The story continues in the Omega Taskforce series. This has been Omega Directive, an Omega Taskforce novella. Written by G J Ogden, performed by Steve Barnes. Copyright 2021 and production copyright 2022 by G J Ogden.